Well, who's David Irving? Well, he is a writer, as I said, not a university historian. He did not have a university degree, but he was a successful writer of books about World War II, particularly about the German side of World War II. He began with a book on the bombing of Dresden, 13th to 14th of February 1945, which became quite well known in Germany, in German translation. This book made extensive claims for atrocities carried out, strafing of civilians fleeing, and gave a very high number of dead in the raids. Thanks to this book, he was regarded among old Nazi circles in Germany as somebody who could be relied upon to put their point of view forward. And so he had access then to a lot of papers and documents in private hands, former generals, former leading Nazis, all kinds of people, which he then published and used for his best-known book, which is called Hitler's War, published in 1977. It was an account of the Second World War from Hitler's point of view. It was followed by other books of a similar sort. He relied entirely on his writing for his income. He didn't have another job. And so he claimed that by calling him a falsifier of history, Deborah Lipstadt and her publishers, Penguin Books, were striking at the very heart of his income and his livelihood. So he claimed exemplary damages. Now, if you're faced with a libel suit like this, you've got a number of choices. You can say that the words complained of are not defamatory, but they clearly were defamatory. He's quite right to say that. You can claim that they don't mean what the person bringing the libel suit says they mean, but Deborah Lipstadt writes a very clear prose, and it's absolutely there. It was in black and white on the page. He falsifies history. He is a Holocaust denier. So there's one avenue left to you. It is to say, yes, the words mean what they're claimed to mean. Yes, it's defamatory, but they're true. And that's an absolute defense in English law. Of course, if you think about it, it's rather topsy-turvy. You, the person who's being accused in a civil action by somebody else, you have to prove that you're innocent. You have to prove that what you said is true. They don't have to prove that what you said is untrue. But that's the way it was. That's explained very clearly in the movie that was made in 2016 called Denial, about the trial. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if it's used in law teaching, because it's a really excellent explanation of the differences in the law. So Anthony Julius, the solicitor, was commissioned by Deborah Lipstadt to organize a defense. The Penguin Commission, they had their own legal department, which had their own solicitors, but it was Anthony Julius who really worked. He was very well known, indeed at that time, even famous solicitor. He had represented Princess Diana in her divorce suit against Prince Charles and won her a record settlement. And while the trial was going on, the preparations for the trial, when I was in the offices of Mishcon de Rea, Anthony Julius's firm, you occasionally see this tall, emaciated figure flitting through. It was Jerry Hall, who is acting on behalf of in a palimony suit against Mick Jagger. So he had a certain reputation. He decided that the defense would be organized around expert witnesses. That's a very important point, because what the trial was about wasn't whether the Holocaust happened or not. It was about, as Irving said quite rightly, at the beginning of his opening statement, it was about what happened within the four walls of his own study, more or less, and in some places where he gave speeches and so on. But it was about his own writing and speaking about the Holocaust. Of course, if you prove that what he said was false and manipulative and based on messing about the sources and so on, then that has a lot of implications for whether the Holocaust happened and the history of the Holocaust. But so kind of the one subject bleeds over into the other. Still, it was a very important distinction to make. What the defense in a libel suit does is to turn the tables. So it puts the spotlight absolutely, directly, unremittingly, unceasingly on the plaintiff, on the claimant. Anything else is a distraction. That was very keen to go into the witness box, but the solicitors, Anthony Julius and his team, wouldn't allow it. Very frustrating. She's a very voluble and powerful speaker, in fact. But she wasn't. She had to keep absolutely silent. No press conferences, no interviews, nothing during the trial. Any of that would have taken the focus off Irving. It would have allowed him to say what he actually wanted to say at the beginning, but was stopped from saying by the judge, which was that she was part of a world conspiracy, a world Jewish conspiracy to discredit him because he was telling the truth about the Holocaust. So witnesses, well, of course, in the Iceman trial in Jerusalem in 1961, a very famous trial in which Adolf Iceman, the SS officer, who had been one of the main people carrying out, ordering and organizing the mass extermination of 6 million Jews in the Second World War, had been kidnapped on a tip-off from German legal officials by the Israeli Secret Service in exile in Argentina and brought to Jerusalem, put on trial. That trial had a long succession of Holocaust survivors coming to testify in the witness stand as to what they had undergone and Eichmann's role in it all. That wasn't what the 2000 trial was about. It focused, as I said, on Irving's writings. I was phoned up in my London office. I was teaching at Birkbeck at the time. I was phoned up by Anthony Julius, who said he'd like me to act as an expert witness. In the last 6 months, he said, it won't be much work, it'll be a doddle. In fact, it took 3 years and became quite clear very quickly that there's far too much material for me to master on my own. So I persuaded the lawyers to pay 2 of my PhD students to help me. And actually, to my horror, I discovered, after I'd written my report, I had to write an expert report on Irving's writings, did he falsify history, was he a Holocaust denier, that every document I cited in my footnotes had to be there in the court. I said I couldn't possibly find them all. So they then employed, in the end they had 40 people in the lawyer's office working on the various expert witness reports, and there were 400 files, or as the courts rather quaintly called them, bundles, as if they were kind of parchment wrapped up in ribbon, around the walls of the court, so people could refer to them. So my job was to look at Irving's writings. My assistants watch videos of his speeches. There's a process called discovery, which means kind of the opposite of what you might think it means, which is it's really disclosure. So each side in the action has to disclose to the other side all the relevant documentation. In fact, Anthony Julius obtained a court order to make Irving disclose everything. My 2 researchers spent 2 weeks in Irving's flat going through all this stuff and getting videos and speeches and so on. Enormous mass of material. And this is one, there were other expert witnesses. As an expert witness who testified to Irving's involvement with the German neo-Nazi groups, there were other expert witnesses who, as it were, testified to the evidence for the Holocaust that Irving was then had been accused by Lipstadt of distorting and manipulating. Christopher Browning, Peter Longerich, there were others. We did actually ask a political scientist to talk about Irving's connections with neo-fascism, but he turned out to be completely useless because I won't mention his name, because he spent too much time writing about the theories of neo-fascism, what is it, how do you define it, what are the varieties. What the court wanted was more or less the same as what historians want. And so in that sense, there was a kind of nice congruence between the epistemological understanding of history and the law. What the court wanted was a statement that would say, At this point, Irving was seen by this witness, here's the quote, here's the document, in this hotel lobby, talking to this man who is well known as a neo-Nazi, here's the documents, and so on. So quite precise empirical material. And that worked really pretty well. And as an expert witness, your duty is to the court. It's just when the trial started, the lawyers were all absolutely really furious because Tony Blair's government had banned them from using Latin in court, and they rather liked to produce Latin phrases with a flourish. So I wasn't called an amicus curiae, but a friend of the court, which they rather grumpily called me. So you're there to advise the court on matters which the court can't be expected to know about itself. The classic, of course, is in a murder case, and you have a pathologist who said the wound was this deep and that angle, and it must have been a left-handed man who was 6'3" tall and wielding a kitchen knife, something, that sort of thing. Actually, most expert witnesses are pharmacologists, so it's by far the most common kind of expert witness. There's a couple of let-out clauses that mean you don't. That get you out of being regarded as being biased. So first of all, probably most important, apart from the fact that you swear an oath to the court that you're going to be absolutely objective and you're not going to pay any attention to who's paying you, because I was paid by the solicitors, you're paid by the hour. So in other words, you put in a kind of weekly bill, the standard rates across the board laid down by the courts, and if you end up with a report, if I reported and said, Irving is a wonderful historian, Lipstadt is talking absolute nonsense, they could not have turned around and said, right, we want our money back. So you are able to be absolutely independent. The movie gets it slightly wrong in this respect, because right at the beginning, in the opening scene, it has me and my assistants sort of saying, oh, we're raring to go, we're going to get him, we're going to nail him, something like that. It wasn't like that at all. We had no idea. We hadn't read Irving's work because it's not useful for academic purposes. It's very much empirical narrative history. And we didn't know what we'd find. And in fact, a lot of the excitement in our weekly meetings was just, one of my assistants would come and say, you'd never guess what I found here, you'd never guess what he's done, how he's changed this, how he's done that, and so on. So that was really not a little bit misleading. So we're expert witnesses. You've got, we started preparing and researching our report. The reports were this must have been in the beginning of 1997. And the court hearing was set for January 2000. The reports have to be in 6 months before so that the other side can get a chance to examine them. Now, I'm sure some of you at least have had the experience of going and asking for an extension to an essay deadline. But if it's a High Court judge saying that's when you've got to get it in, that's not going to work. So it's a really absolutely tight deadline. The court case rested on expert witness reports, and the preliminary hearing before an official known as the Master of the Queen's Bench, this hearing, again, it appears in the movie quite accurately. Irving was persuaded that it should be tried by a judge and not by a jury. One of the slightly impressive things about the whole case was the fact that the lawyers were very keen to keep the case as short as possible and to reduce the costs as far as possible. So if a jury had been considering it, then I'd have had to be in the witness box basically telling the jury what was in my report, and the same with the other expert witnesses. As it was, the judge read the report and based his judgment on that, plus on all the reports, plus the testimony given by us and the court proceedings. The defense had the option of not calling an expert witness. In fact, we didn't call this political scientist at all, because they felt that it wouldn't be very useful. And if they don't call you as an expert witness to go into the court and be cross-examined, then the court has to disregard your report, just doesn't bother with it. So that's another let-out for the expert witness. It means you can write whatever you like. So it was heard before a single judge, Charles Gray, who was an expert, very experienced former barrister in the whole area of defamation law. The second peculiarity of the case was that Irving conducted his own case. Either he couldn't afford a barrister, or he didn't think he could rely on a barrister to make the political capital out of the case that he wanted to. Now the case, why did he bring the case? Well, you have to go back a bit. So 1977, his book, Hitler's War, very successful. He bought a Rolls Royce, had a flat in Mayfair, was doing very well. But then, in the second half of the 1980s, he changed his views on the Holocaust. Up to then, he'd been regarded as a solid historian with an ability to dig up new sources, rather eccentric on the matter of Hitler, who he claimed was either did not know about the Holocaust or had tried to stop it. And it's characteristic he didn't see there was a contradiction between these two arguments. But in the late 1980s, a case was brought against a German-Canadian man called Ernst Zundel, who was a Holocaust denier. And he was prosecuted in Canada under a rather archaic law against spreading false news. It dated, I think, from the days of the American Revolutionary Wars, and which is subsequently ruled unconstitutional, and Zundel was then deported. But Zundel called a number of witnesses, and he called Irving, and in his defense. And Irving read a curious document called the Luchter Report. And Fred Luchter, a rather sinister figure who made a living designing lethal injection facilities for American penitentiaries, had been sent by Holocaust deniers in California to, at the self-styled Institute for Historical Review, to Auschwitz to take samples off the inner walls of the crematorium building where large numbers of Jews had been gassed. So he went there, illegally took them off, put them in a bag, sent them to a chemist without saying what they were, and they came back, and the chemist said there's a very small, tiny residue of cyanide, a precipitation of cyanide there. So Luchter concluded triumphantly that, therefore, this cannot have been a gas chamber used to kill people. It must have been used for delousing clothes. Briefly, there are two problems with this. One is that he took great chunks out of the wall instead of taking very minute scrapings off the inner wall so that it would have been diluted. And secondly, you do need 22 times greater concentration of hydrogen cyanide to kill a human being than a louse, because a louse can creep into the interstices of clothes and so on. Humans just breathe it and they die. So it was a completely phony, fraudulent piece of science. But Irving claimed to believe it. He judged the moment was right and became a fully fledged Holocaust denier. Now, so he's got this idea that Hitler was basically didn't know or tried to stop the Holocaust, and also, in any case, the Holocaust didn't happen. So, in fact, that was his argument. How could he be a Holocaust denier if it didn't happen? You can't deny something that hasn't happened, but this is a logical tangle that the court decided it wasn't going to get involved with. He changed his books. So when Hitler's War came out in 1992, in another new edition, he had changed Auschwitz from a death camp to a labor camp. He'd expunged all the references to the Holocaust and to gas chambers. And in fact, by that time, he wasn't able to publish his work by mainstream publishers. Penguin published Hitler's War in 1977, but Irving had become known now since 1987-1988 as a Holocaust denier. He got into a lot of trouble when he discovered through a tip-off that after the fall of communism, that there was a complete set now accessible of Joseph Goebbels' diaries, the diaries of the propaganda chief of the Nazis, on glass plates, kind of microfiche. There were bits and pieces that had been known before, but not a complete set. They're very, very voluminous. Goebbels was one of these diarists who just has to write every day about what happened the day before. And they were in the Moscow KGB Special Archive. The KGB, its predecessor, the NKVD, had taken a lot of documents from Germany and squirreled them away in its own archive for its own use. And this stuff was now available. And Irving was very good at reading the old German handwriting. Goebbels was writing quite difficult. So he managed to sell this, the idea of translating and printing extracts to the Sunday Times. Now, the Sunday Times had its fingers burnt with the Hitler diaries in 1983, a blatant forgery. It insisted that Irving should actually prove the documents, the diaries, the plates were genuine. So he smuggled one out, had it tested, and then smuggled it back in the archive. They were undoubtedly genuine. But when they came out, of course he was selecting extracts and translating them in a way that showed Hitler in a favorable light. And there was a huge storm. The Sunday Times had to cancel his contract. They had to pay him the fee nonetheless. It cost them some money. It didn't get them a very good reputation. So after that, he could only publish, and can still only publish, his work himself, self-published. The 1992 edition of Hitler's War was self-published. And oddly enough, when I went to consult it in the British Library, I had to go to the pornography desk. Now, I don't know if you've ever done this, but in the British Library, if you're reading pornography, well, some scholars do, they're perfectly reputable. There's a special desk with a sort of surveillance in front of it, sort of keep your hands on the table, this kind of thing, you know. So I had to read it there. And when I told this in court, Irving got really furious. And I don't know why the British Library did this. Maybe they thought neo-Nazis would get too excited or something. But there it was, and there were other things, and there were a lot of speeches that my poor assistants had to read and transcribe parts of, and so on. So we produced our report, 740 pages of it. Robert Jan van Pelt, expert on Auschwitz, who had discovered contemporary documents by the firms that built the gas chambers, he wrote a 600-page report. There's 2,000 pages of documentation. And that's what you do in a libel case. 6 pages of lip stat, 2,000 pages of expert testimony saying the same thing, but a lot more and in a lot more detail. This is presented to the court, and the proceedings then began with the judge, I think, having read all the reports, obviously, and they began with Irving being cross-examined by Richard Rampton, the defense QC, and then the expert witnesses coming on and being cross-examined in their turn by Irving. I was in the witness box for 28 hours over about 10 days. It's quite stressful business. There's a 2.5-hour session in the morning, 2.5-hour session in the afternoon, being subjected relentlessly to hostile questioning all the time. I got two pieces of advice from Anthony Julius. One, don't look him in the eye or you'll get annoyed. I did at the beginning, and then I rethought it and addressed my remarks to the judge, because in the end you are advising the court. And that in turn got Irving annoyed, and he started calling me witness and being quite abrupt. Secondly, don't drink too much water. It's embarrassing to ask for a comfort break. So that's the only advice I got. And I wasn't actually asked, I wasn't allowed to see or meet or talk to the defense team while I was in the witness box during those 10 days. But fortunately, my old tutor from Oxford, Sir Martin Gilbert, the biographer of Churchill, and author of a large number of books about Jewish history, was attending the trial, oddly enough, to recover from a quadruple heart bypass operation. I can think of more relaxing things to do, but still, there he was. And so he very kindly took me out for lunch every day while I was in the witness box. It was an extraordinary trial. It's a civil action. It's not a criminal action. And in a civil action, it's decided on the balance of probabilities. And that, of course, is what we do as historians. We make our decisions on the balance of probabilities, and we conclude this or that, exactly what the court did. So there's no real clash of epistemology there either. Well, of course, I don't want to go into any detail about the trial. There isn't really time. The movie, Denial, does actually give a pretty fair account of the trial. Every courtroom scene is taken direct and unchanged from the transcripts. So I had the rather odd experience of seeing an actor saying my lines, what I had actually said myself, on the screen. I have to say, John Sessions, who played me, should have lost weight before he played me on the screen, I think. But apart from that, of course, he was actually giving my evidence, and I thought, God, I was really good, wasn't I? And then, of course, I realized he's an actor. He can practice them. He can actually deliver them forcefully. I probably sort of mumbled them. I only had one shot at it and was sort of unprepared. It was a curious experience because Irving was so confident. He didn't believe that an academic, even a Cambridge professor, could actually pick holes, major, huge holes in what he'd been doing. And so he didn't start reading my report until very late on in the day, not far, around about Christmas, I think. And so he questioned me sort of page by page. What did we find? What we found was not shaken in the least by Irving's questioning. What we said was absolutely solid. It's taken a lot of effort to do. What did we find? Well, we found massive manipulation. We found he'd put words into quotes from sources. We got hold of the original sources. We had a cooperation from archives in Washington, Moscow, Munich, Berlin, Tel Aviv, London, everywhere, all over the place. He'd taken words out when he quoted them. He'd changed the order of sentences. He picked a bad translation when it favored his own argument, and a good one, if that favored his own argument, when he was using English translations. Mostly it was about German. Normally, with Holocaust deniers, as with other conspiracy theorists, it's very unprofitable to engage in debate, because you might have an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours even, or a seminar or a lecture or something like that. All you've got is sound bites. You can't actually get into subjects in any depth. In the court, we had limitless time. We could pursue every point as long as we wanted to. We could argue the toss until the judge suddenly said wearily, right, I've got the point, let's move on. Journalists attended the case in the press gallery, but more or less as soon as I got into the witness box, the press gallery emptied, because it was mostly about German documents, and they got very bored very quickly. The one press report of my cross-examination said, disbelievingly, they spent half an hour arguing about the place of a full stop in a document. But that's a great advantage. We had 3 months. We could discuss all of these different aspects in absolute depth, as long and as much as we wanted to. So the case was decided by the judge in the favor of the defense. He found that Lipstadt's allegations were true and dismissed Irving's suit. Awarded costs against him. The costs came to something over £3 million by the time everybody gets paid, especially Rich Rampton, the barrister, who was worth every penny, absolutely brilliant. He even learnt German for the case in his early 50s. And of course, Irving declared himself bankrupt and never paid a penny. The costs are paid by Penguin's Insurance. Every publisher is insured against libel for the first $1 million. And then Pearson Longman, who the multinational owned Penguin, and then a fundraising effort by Deborah Lipstadt. The impression given by the movie that Deborah Lipstadt is raised all the money herself is not really terribly accurate. So it was, well, the two remaining questions, I think. First of all, why did Irving do it? Secondly, why did he have those views? So the judge said he had prejudices, he was a racist, he was anti-Semitic, and he manipulated the evidence to try and conform to his prejudices. Why did he do that? Now the second question is, what did it all mean? Okay, so after the trial, well, the one before and one after, he was incautious enough to be interviewed by two radio psychiatrists, and these guys have got a way of making you reveal a bit more than you think you're revealing. And in addition to that, I was rung up in my office just after the trial, and the chap said he'd announced himself as a psychiatrist writing about Freudian slips. Now, in his final statement to the court, Irving at one point mistakenly called the judge Mein Führer. Amazing. You could hardly believe it, but everybody fell about laughing until the judge called order. And this psychiatrist said, "Did you really say it?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure. I could swear I heard it, but it seems so weird, so unlikely." So the judge, the psychiatrist said, "Yeah, the judge said." He said he did say it because Charles Gray, the judge, was unusually forthcoming for a High Court judge, and the psychiatrist phoned him up too, and he said yes, Irving had mumbled an apology to him while everyone was falling about laughing. So how do you explain all this? Well, Irving was born in 1938, and he lived in Brentwood, just to the east of London. His father went away to sea in 1941, I think, and never came back, as sailors do. He found a wife at another port, or for whatever reason, he didn't come back to the family. And almost straight away, Irving found a substitute father figure, oddly enough, in Hitler, because his mother must presumably have told him, according to these psychiatrists, that his father was going to fight for Mr. Churchill, for whom Irving then conceived a visceral hatred, and he has a twin brother. This twin brother actually even changed his name at one point in his life when he was working for the Ministry of Defense. And he remembers Irving, at the age of 4, taking him out and giving a Nazi salute to German bombers going overhead. Somehow he had this sort of hotline to the truth about Hitler, that he was a good guy. He could do no wrong. And so if the evidence said anything against that, he was entitled to alter the evidence, because with the evidence it wasn't true. And in that sense, his Holocaust denial and his denial and Hitler's involvement in it had all kind of merged into one. And that was the motivation, I think, the personal motivation behind the whole business. And he was, of course, absolutely politically a neo-fascist. He'd even at one point in the early 80s tried to form his own neo-fascist movement in Britain, but it had failed since he'd announced that he would provide the officers and the National Front and BNP and these other organizations, provide the foot soldiers, which they weren't really very pleased about hearing that. That was really, I think, why he did it, and to get back into publicity, to be able to spread his ideas through the medium of the court, when he was no longer able from the early 90s to present them through books that were sold in bookshops, talks, lectures, and so on. Well, what did it mean? Well, first of all, I think we did discredit Irving. There were a number of historians. One very senior historian, an expert on Nazi Germany, told me just before the trial that we would never be able to prove it, that he was, on the whole, a perfectly respectable historian, apart from some odd ideas about Hitler. He called two leading historians, John Keegan, D.C. Watt, as witnesses, who said more or less the same sort of thing, and then, after the trial, wrote articles in the press denouncing me and saying that it was all terribly biased. Any historian who was subjected to the kind of forensic dissection that I and my team had done you'd find exactly the same thing. But it's absolutely true. In fact, when I met Cameron Watt, I said, are you really telling me that if I went through all your work, I'd find it was just as manipulated as Irving's? Of course he had to say no, and it's true. This is a level of manipulation far greater than you see anywhere else. And crucially, of course, we historians make mistakes. We get things wrong. We make little slips. It's inevitable, however much you try. You know, you publish a book, you've been through it 10 times, you have proofreaders, you've had copy editors and so on. The first time you get the published copy, you open it and you find a misprint on a page. The point about his mistakes was that they were all in the same direction. All of his errors supported his own arguments. Now, if you're just careless, the effect will be random. Some will support your arguments, some won't, some will be irrelevant to them. And that, I think, above all, is what convinced the judge that Irving was deliberately manipulating and falsifying the material. What we did, I think, discredited him. He's not been able to recover. We also, I think, upheld the freedom of speech. This has often been misunderstood by commentators. The point was that Irving wanted a book, Deborah Lipstadt's book, withdrawn, pulped. He wanted her and Penguin and everyone to commit themselves never to repeating these allegations about him or anyone else. It would have been impossible, had he won, to say that anybody was a Holocaust denier and a falsifier and manipulator of history. So it held the lines that it hasn't stopped Irving from talking, writing works of Holocaust denial, nor has it stopped anyone else. There are countries in which Holocaust denial is illegal, but in my view, and in that of Deborah Lipstadt as well, as we both appeared in the Union and the other place, arguing a debate for this, it's wrong to outlaw Holocaust denial. It turns them into martyrs for the freedom of speech. And they're certainly not interested in freedom of speech. It gives them a prominence they don't deserve, and it's very difficult to prove. Irving, eventually, when he went to Austria, was arrested and imprisoned for a year under a Holocaust denial law. He was allowed one phone call a day. Who did he make the first phone call to? It wasn't to his wife or his child. It was to the BBC. It gave him a lot of publicity, which he craved. It's the oxygen of Holocaust deniers' lives. The victory for freedom of speech was only partial because publishers remained worried about being sued for libel. I boiled down my report, added some impressions of the trial, and tried to get it published as a book. Came out in America, fine. Britain, turned down by 6 publishers because Irving was writing to everyone, threatening to sue them if they published my work. In the end, I enlisted a couple of journalists who wrote about this scandal, and Tariq Ali phoned up, a Trotskyite activist and director of New Left Books. We must publish this book to defeat this fascist. And so I went with him and the director, the financial director of Verso, New Left Books, to Anthony Julius, who offered to represent them in a strikeout action. Now, as I say, if Irving had sued, then they could say, strike this action out, please, because it's already been decided. You don't want to fight the whole thing all over again. Even that would have cost some money, however, and but that was free. Anthony Julius said, we'll do it for free. The barrister, you won't have to pay the barrister, you won't have to pay us. Even that didn't convince most publishers, but the political drive behind Tariq Ali and the directors of Verso was sufficient to overcome the financial directors' worries. I have never seen before or since a man literally shaking with fear, as I did that financial director in Anthony Julius's office. But they published it. It was a great success. For about 6 months, it sold 5,000 copies in 6 months, and then sort of declined, lost the public interest. Somebody asked the publicity director of Verso, aren't you worried about being sued for libel? He said, no, bring it on. I mean, we need the publicity. Nobody's ever heard of us. I mean, if we become a centre of a big libel, exactly the right case. Well, there's a but in this. Because I think we felt perhaps a bit complacent about what we'd achieved. Because I think the rise of the internet, the rise of social media, has actually brought Holocaust denial back. It's because the traditional gatekeepers of opinion formation and journalism and expressions of opinion, newspaper editors, radio, TV editors, magazine editors, they're essentially bypassed by the internet. And so there's a lot of Holocaust denial out there. In addition, there's the old style neo-Nazi, neo-fascist Holocaust denial, which is absolutely central to their beliefs, has been joined by Islamist extremist Holocaust denial. And so most of the websites, Holocaust denial websites you find now, a large number of them are Islamist extremists. But in a way, it's less important to them than it was to old-style fascists, because their aim, of course, is to discredit the State of Israel. So insofar as the Holocaust is a legitimating factor in the existence of Israel, they will attack its legitimacy. But much more important to them, I think, are criticisms of the policies of the Israeli government, treatment of the Palestinians, Gaza, and all of those kinds of things. Nevertheless, I think we are in a situation where we have to be concerned again about Holocaust denial. In conclusion, let me say that I am very proud of my involvement in the case. It took 3 years and not 6 months, as Anthony Julius had said. I started it as a kind of test case for some arguments I've been putting forward about truth and falsehood in a little book I wrote called In Defense of History, but it became much bigger than that. Who could fail to be moved? Looking at the public galleries, and we had to move after the first day to the biggest court on the Strand, when you could see elderly people sitting there with their sleeves rolled up and their Auschwitz prisoner to 2 numbers showing, sitting next to young skinheads with swastika tattoos on their necks. It was an extraordinary achievement. I think Daily Telegraph, a paper I don't often agree with, but a paper that said, I think quite rightly, after the trial, that it did for the 21st century what the Iceman trial did for the second half of the 20th. Because I think what we showed, contrary to Deborah Lipstadt's concern that when survivors finally die out, there'll be nobody left to tell the tale, Holocaust denial will become easier and get more credence. It showed that historians, when we look at all the evidence, examine it carefully, we can reach reasoned conclusions. Yes, it did happen. Yes, it was one of the greatest crimes in human history. Why it was perpetrated and many other questions of that sort we can continue to argue with. The basic facts, I think, are well established. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for that fantastic talk. We're going to move now to just a few questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, raise your hand. We'll go to the gentleman in the pink sweater.
Thank you. So clearly Irving was defeated and he ran out of oxygen, but he was only an individual. So how do you think we should defeat the manipulation of history by governments and states, for instance, over issues like the Armenian genocide and the massacre of Chinese civilians in the 30s and 40s, which are still kind of manipulated and partially denied by current Japanese and Turkish governments?
That's a really good question. I mean, Irving is important, of course, because he was a relatively respectable historian before the trial. And therefore his ideas were given more credence than those of others, more obvious extremists. How should we deal with the distortion of the truth by governments? Well, I think that is a very serious issue, and become more serious, I think. You can go back in history and found, I mean, there's nobody told more lies than Joseph Goebbels, for example, in the Nazi regime. But there are a lot of deniers of genocidal mass murders, whatever you want to call them. There's a great deal of manipulation of history that goes on. I think the best way to do it is just to insist on telling the truth. It sounds very simple and maybe a bit naive, but it's our duty, I think, to counter these, whatever the cost. And the other thing I want to say is that we should insist as much as possible, as strongly as possible, that governments should not get involved in telling people what to believe about history. So you have the absurd situation that it is illegal in Turkey to say that the murder of Armenians in World War I in 1915 by the Ottoman Empire was a genocide. There had been strong movement in France to declare it illegal to say that it wasn't a genocide. Governments get involved in manipulating and laying down what they want people to believe about the past. I had a tangle with Michael Gove in 2013, the early part of this decade, over his attempts to reform the school curriculum for history, which he wanted made into a patriotic narrative celebrating the triumphs and wonders of British achievements through the centuries. And finally, there was a large movement amongst historians, British Academy, Royal Historical Society, and so on, against that, and we managed to stop that. We have to keep on fighting, I think.
I'll go to the gentleman in the second row.
So you touched upon this slightly in your closing remarks with the internet and also now with...
Sorry, you have to speak a bit more slowly and a bit more...
Of course.
Loud.
You touched upon this with your closing remarks and also now with using truth to combat the spread of misinformation. But how is this an effective strategy in the rise of what is called a post-truth society, where we are losing these standards for universal objective truth in favor for more individual truth and believing what one wishes to believe or what feels true?
Yeah, well, I think we have to respect evidence. What the evidence does is to, I think, constitute the boundaries within which we can argue. Of course, you can dispute those boundaries, but there are boundaries in the end. So you can argue endlessly about who started the First World War. Was it Germany? Was it Russia? Was it Serbia? Was it France? And so on. But if you say it was a rocket full of little green men who came down from space, I think you're entitled to say that's not true. So when you talk about objectivity, for me that means focusing upon the object, the evidence. Of course, these things are all arguable, but that is what I think we have to focus on. And one of the worrying things about the internet and social media is how opinion seems to be all that matters, and that the fact it doesn't really matter if there's no evidence for an opinion. So I think that would be my response, I think.
We're going to have 2 more questions. We'll go to the gentleman in the first row and then the gentleman of the third row.
Thank you for your talk. You talk about kind of using sources honestly, and I've recently been studying the Civil War and the dispute between Kishlansky and John Adamson. And I was just wondering, within the context of university, we're taught to write streamlined essays with arguments, and the argument is central. But how is a 3-hour exam going to how does that constitute good learning for historical practice? Shouldn't it be an exam based on a piece of evidence that we found and analysed, rather than a streamlined argument with evidence that might not even really be true in of itself?
Well, I mean, university history education is both, isn't it? If you do a special subject, you have to do a special subject in your final year, and that is based on the analysis of documents. So it's not just opinions. I mean, I always thought that writing a short essay on a big subject was a wonderful basis for becoming a politician, because it gives you confidence in talking about things you really don't know very much about, but at the same time plausibly and they hope convincingly. that's in a way why I went on from being an undergraduate historian to doing a doctorate, where you have a chance to pick one subject and going into it in enormous depth to satisfy one's desire to study things more deeply. But I think the good history degree will surely combine both of those things within the limits of 3 years of study.
Okay, go to the gentleman on the third row.
Professor, thank you so much. I wanted to ask 2 questions, if possible, and I apologise if this is outside.
Could we make sure they're quick, because
Sure.
we are running out of time?
So you spent obviously a number of days across the room from David Irving. I was hoping you could maybe give us some colour on like your reflections of the man himself. Like there's obviously a lot of talk about your personal.
So you have to repeat that.
About your personal dislike of him. Like the Wikipedia page says so. Like
So I can't really follow. Sorry, what's he saying?
Oh, sorry. You spent a number of days sitting across the room from David Irving. Can you maybe cast some colour on whether you personally like or dislike the man, and how you were able to keep calm over 10 days when...
All right. So when I was in the witness box being cross-examined by Irving, well, of course it's a very weird, unfamiliar situation. But once I'd kind of calmed my nerves at the beginning, I insisted. He would say, "Now you say, Professor Evans, that blah blah blah." So I'd say, "Can you point me to the passage on page whichever name the page and the paragraph and the passage in my report?" And the judge said, "Come on, Professor Evans, do we really need this?" So I said, "I'm afraid we do, because I can't trust Mr. Irving to give an accurate rendition of what I'd said." And that was true. Time after time, I found that when he claimed I'd said something in my report, it wasn't actually what I said at all. And that gave me confidence, I think, to continue. And I sort of got the measure of him, really. There was quite a dramatic moment when we were discussing Hitler's political testament. And there's an extraordinary passage there where, in effect, he admits to the Holocaust. And he says, the Jews have been made to pay for their crimes, i.e. he blamed the Jews for the bombing of German cities, even if only in a more humane way, meaning gas chambers. So Irving said, "So are you saying, Professor, that the gas chambers were humane?" I said, "No, it's Hitler who's saying that." And we kind of gasped some of the audience at that level of distortion. You know, they used to say about Harold Wilson, a Labour Prime Minister decades ago, that he was so devious that if he swallowed a 6-inch nail, it'd come out the other end as a corkscrew. and I got that feeling about him. So it was stressful in the sense I had to look at every single passage. Sometimes he'd quote a sentence from the middle of one of my paragraphs, which gave it a different meaning from when he had in the whole paragraph. So I'd start reading the whole paragraph, and he'd then start shouting at me. But I actually asked the stenographer, there were stenographers, they were amazing women, taking it all down, and we all had computer screens where what had been said 3 or 4 minutes before would start rolling down. So I said to her, "Well, when we're both talking at once, who do you listen to?" And she said, "Well, the one who shouts the louder." So I raised my voice after that.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Just a few notes. The Cayley tickets are going online. They went online 2 minutes ago. So if you haven't yet bought a ticket, we have another limited release. The Cayley takes place on Saturday. And we also have George Dorsati later today, which is in collaboration with the Wilberforce Society. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the stewards who have made this event possible, the Clio who have collaborated with us, and all of you for coming here, and last but not least, Professor Evans. If you could all join me for one last round of applause.